And you also think in the chapter about how both Freud and Rogers were thinking about how practice would change, and the friction that can be like as we learn something as almost like a disciple of Rogers, or maybe earlier disciples of Freud, and then the next generations come along and it's molding to another environment. And
I think there's some interesting examples of that. Well, first of all, I do think that the founding fathers and mothers, because there were some mothers who founded traditions, they tend to be, I mean, they've obviously got their own thing, they plough their own furrow, but most of them were, to me, the ones that I've read were quite open to different ideas. It seems to me that the disciples, that first generation who come along afterwards, who get very much more rigid about, this is empathy, or, like Truax and Kharkov talk about an empathy scale, and, 5 out of 5 for empathy, or B+ for empathy, or acceptance, or whatever, and become rather mechanistic about it. I was part of background reading for the book. I read some really interesting books, and I reread some old, golden oldies. But I came across this book which talked about Freud's desire and prediction that psychoanalysis would change in order for it to, be more accessible to ordinary people and in clinics. And he wasn't, he didn't sort of promulgate this idea of sort of endless, 4 times a week analysis forever. That came later in a way. And in fact, most people who work with Freud often go to Vienna for 6 months and do sort of intensive analysis, but then it finished. But he was talking about he would rather things change than to be sort of reified or become a dogma, which I talked about in 2 sessions ago. And the same with Rogers. He was, I think, fairly relaxed and famously said, thank God I don't have to be Rogerian. When people sort of accuse, getting into all these sort of purism. So I agree. I think it is interesting how things change, and I think it's, in a way, it's a bit challenging, particularly when you, as you know, and you've seen me, sort of sometimes challenge person-centered colleagues for becoming too theory-centered. And it seems like they're losing, if the philosophy is being person-centered, then they should be centered on the person and use a range of skills, not only one set that, maybe Rogers emphasized more. So I do feel a bit more sort of freer, I suppose, about and questioning of what can we take from other approaches, even if it's to study an approach and say, I'm clear that I don't want to do that. I don't want to touch clients, not because I might hug somebody if I feel that's okay and it's wanted and so on, but probably very rarely these days. But it's more about I don't think that sort of reparative way of being works. I think it's more, somebody says, I'd like to hug because you're the father I never had. Well, I'm more interested in looking at how can we work with the disappointment of me not being the father you never had, or whatever. It's a different way. So I think we can learn from looking outwards and then bring it back to, what's our preferences and what do we think the client needs.